Hi everybody, Dan Bailey here with some more cool photography tips for you. This is going to be the third lesson in a series that I've done about exposure. And if you haven't seen those other two lessons, you can click this link right here and watch the most recent video I've done. For many people, exposure is the most technical and intimidating aspect of photography because it's the one thing that revolves around numerical values. And this scares people because it sounds a lot like math. In fact, it is math. In a sense, exposure has everything to do with numbers, ratios, and division. Now fortunately, you don't actually have to do the math most of the time because the camera's computer will figure it out for you. However, there are some times the camera won't get it right, and those are the times where you need to compensate and figure out how to make the right adjustments in order to get the proper exposure for your scene. And that's why it helps to have complete familiarization with your gear and also with the types of situations that you might encounter. At the very least, you want to know the basics of how exposure works so that when things are unfolding quickly in front of you, you can respond accordingly. It can be hard enough to get the right exposure in tricky light with a still subject, but if things start moving, if the lights start changing, if your subject is moving, that's when it gets real. As you probably know, the right exposure is achieved through a combination of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Now, those three settings are considered to be the foundations of the exposure triangle. Now, all of these three settings work in direct relationship to each other, and even though you can use any combination of those settings to achieve the right exposure, each one of those settings will affect the picture differently and give you a different look. And this is where you need to figure out what trade-offs to make in order to achieve the exact look you're going for in your photo. In the previous two lessons, I talked about how to ensure proper exposure when shooting with mirrorless cameras, and also how to use aperture, shutter speed, ISO, and the histogram to gain even more control in the process and fine-tune your exposures depending on what kind of look you're going for. In this lesson, I'm going to tie it all together and talk about the most crucial, important decisions that you need to make in order for all this to fall into place. If things like aperture, shutter speed, and ISO are the ingredients, think of these decisions as your master recipe for getting a good shot. As capable as modern cameras are with regards to exposure, it's these decisions that will ultimately determine how your photos look and whether they succeed or not. For as much information and detail that modern camera sensors can record, they still don't match the tonal range that your eyes and brain can recognize out in the world. No camera can record details in the brightest highlights and the deepest, darkest shadows at the same time. And this is perhaps the most important thing to remember when it comes to exposure. Of course, you can do this with HDR photography by blending multiple exposures, but this never looks quite real, and our brains know that. And that's why HDR photos have such a unique look. Now, one of the general guidelines with digital photography is that you should expose your pictures to the right. And that essentially means that it's better to overexpose your pictures than underexpose your pictures. Of course, this doesn't take into account what looks aesthetically better to us as viewers. We're much more drawn to deep saturated images with dark shadows than we are to overexposed whites. In fact, there's nothing less appealing in a photo than a totally white washed out sky. So how do we get around these limitations and contradictions and create photos that show enough tonal information without blowing out too much of the scene? This is where your uncreative decisions come into play. Knowing that your camera won't be able to record everything, you need to evaluate the scene and prioritize the importance of each piece of subject matter within your frame. A few minutes ago I told you that there's one photography tip that you should remember. I'm going to revise that and give you a new one. If there's one exposure rule you should permanently burn into your brain and remember for the rest of your life, it's this. Your brightest subject matter and your most important subject matter must be in the same light, or else you'll have too much contrast. In reality, they can be in similar light, but for the purpose of this lesson, we're going to say that they must be in the same light. Let's say that you're shooting a scene that has very bright skies and dark shadows, and maybe your subject's moving in and out of the shadows, or else there's something in those darker areas of the frame that you'd ideally like to preserve in the shot. If you were to expose for your sky, then your shadows would drop to black and you'd lose any and all detail in those darker areas of the frame. However, if you were to expose for your shadows, then your sky would end up completely washed out. And as I said, in most cases, there's nothing less appealing in a photo than a washed out white sky. In order to shoot this scene in such a way that you get the most dynamic, exciting look for your image and still preserve the most important details of your scene, you need to establish a hierarchy of your subject matter in terms of visual and creative importance, and then do one of these four things. Number one, wait for different light. Wait for the shadows to pass. Wait for the clouds to move away from the sun. Or come back and shoot the scene at a different time of day. Perhaps at sunset. Maybe later in the day the sun will have shifted around enough to illuminate those darker areas you were trying to show before. Now here's an example of how I might deal with a situation like this. After shooting this scene as is, I came back a little later in the evening and created a much more dynamic image. This approach might work well if you're shooting in the forest. It's tough to shoot under a thick canopy in a sunny day. There's just too much contrast with all the trees and shadows. So overcast days, cloudy days work great for shooting inside the forest. Number 2, wait for your subject to come out of the shadows. If you're shooting a moving subject, maybe you'll just need to wait a few seconds or a few minutes for them to pass through the shadows and come back into the sunshine. In this photo, my subject is lost in the dark tones of cloud cover. By waiting till she's out of the shadows, I can capture a much brighter, more defined image. Number 3, recompose and exclude the highlights. Instead of trying to show both, shoot with a different framing and exclude as much of the highlight detail as possible. And a couple ways you can do this are simply changing vantage points or zooming in with a longer lens. By simply changing vantage points, I can create a composition that has the same feel without including the large washed out areas. Number 4, let your shadows drop to black. Instead of trying to look into your shadows, let them drop into inky black fields of rich darkness. After all, compelling shadows usually look pretty good in photos. Here's another approach. If there's no way to get your subject out of the shadows, simply shoot the scene as a silhouette. This will preserve the colors in your bright sky, and it looks great if you're shooting at sunset, and it will create a suggestion of your main subject. With many types of scenes, you don't actually have to show every single detail in order to tell a compelling visual story. Sometimes the less you show, the more powerful your image will be. If you've seen my video about abbreviation in photography, this is exactly what I'm talking about. So from that standpoint, shooting a silhouette not only solves your contrast and exposure issues, it also gives you the chance to create a pretty powerful composition. Okay, now that we've established that all-important rule, and we've learned 4 possible solutions that can help get you out of those contrast problems, let's see how we can bring in the other 3 main exposure ingredients: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Based on how you want to shoot the scene, there's always one factor that's more important than the other 2. I call this your limiting factor, and whenever you're thinking about your exposure decisions, you should always keep that limiting factor in the forefront of your mind. It's the first thing you should think about when you've decided how you want to frame your scene. And sometimes you'll want to consider your limiting factor even before you start thinking about what's going to go where in the frame. Here are some simple examples to show you how to think about the limiting factor. They basically revolve around the specific creative ideas that you have for the scene and ultimately how you want your picture to look. Example 1. This skier is moving down the slope very quickly, and I want to make sure I freeze the action with my long lens. So my limiting factor is a fast shutter speed. Example 2. I want to create a motion blur shot. My limiting factor here is a slow shutter speed. Example 3. I want a shallow focus behind the subject to make it pop against a nice blurry background. Example 4. I want to show maximum depth of field so that everything is in focus in the frame. So here my limiting factor is using a narrow aperture. Example 5. I want minimal noise and the highest possible resolution for this shot. So my limiting factor is a low ISO setting. And finally, number 6. If I'm going for a gritty picture and want lots of grain in my photo, I'll want to use a high ISO. So with these 6 examples, you can see that each one corresponds to one extreme or the other with either shutter speed, aperture, or ISO. Of course, not every situation is going to require an adjustment on the extreme end of one of those parameters, but looking at it this way helps you figure out what you're dealing with in the moment. And here's another important guideline. While there might be situations where you can combine some of these parameters, there are some situations where you simply can't achieve both in the same image. Depending on factors like the available light, the speed of your lens, how fast your subject's moving, how close or far away the subject is from your camera, there might be situations where you simply cannot achieve the look you're going for. For example, in most situations, it's impossible to shoot with a maximum depth of field, the highest shutter speed, and the lowest ISO possible. There will always be situations where at least 2 of these combinations will clash, especially if you're shooting in dim or contrasty light. Now you'll probably find that you don't run into some of these limitations when you're shooting in the middle of the day when there's plenty of available light. But in those situations, you may lack the most important limiting factor of all, which is good light. When you're trying to capture that last magical light on your subject, or shoot action at sunrise or sunset, you're gonna run into some of these problems. And the way to get around that is to ask yourself one of these two questions. What limiting factor do I need in order to make the shot work the way I want it to? And what other factor am I willing to sacrifice in order to get the shot? And of course, most of the times, your sacrifice is going to be simply cranking the ISO dial up a little bit, which is, in today's camera, is really not much of an issue. Or it could mean using a just slightly different shutter speed or aperture, depending on what you're shooting. Either way, once you come up with those answers, you'll use them to adjust your exposure using the corresponding limiting factor that's crucial to getting the shot the way you want it. When we put this all together, we end up with a little exposure checklist that you can incorporate into your mental workflow every time you approach a scene. Gauge your scene and determine your most important limiting factor. Then determine what your most important bright subject matter is. Use that information to determine your proper exposure, and then adjust your controls to compensate for your limiting factor. Remember, your limiting factor and your corresponding exposure will vary depending on the parameters of the scene, the available light, and what specific creative ideas you have for the shot. And it won't necessarily give you the right exposure, but it'll give you the exposure that you want that best suits the creative ideas that you have for your shot. And it's very likely that another photographer will have different creative ideas and a different limiting factor in mind, and so they'll approach the scene with a different set of exposure parameters and make different decisions. But that's where the whole thing revolves around your own individual creativity and your own specific ideas for the pictures that you want to make. Okay, that's all for now. I'm going to end the lesson here. I hope you enjoyed hearing my insight and found this to be a helpful tutorial. I encourage you to go watch the other 2 exposure lessons that I did, and also go watch some of my other videos as well. You'll find that a lot of my lessons build on each other, and they all work together to help give you a comprehensive approach to photography. Also, check out my Photography on the Brain lesson series, where I delve even deeper into the realm of creativity and explore photography and image making from a much more cerebral standpoint. And that's available as either a monthly series, where you get a new lesson each month, or you can get the first 10 lessons as a bundle. And either way, you can get the series or the bundle at a special price right now, so have a look. And finally, please subscribe to my channel. You can leave a comment if you wish. You can find me on social media and Patreon at Dan Bailey Photo. You can check out my blog and website as well. So thanks for watching this lesson. Good luck with your exposures out there. I'll see you next time.